greatest care. They loved being allowed to carry things. "Have you said good morning to your father?" "Yes, Grandma." They settled themselves on the bench opposite Stanley and Beryl. "Good morning, Stanley." Old Mrs. Fairfield gave him his plate. "Morning, Mother. How's the boy?" "Splendid. He only woke up once last night. What a perfect morning." The old woman paused, her hand on the loaf of bread, to gaze out of the open door into the garden. The sea sounded. Through the wide open window streamed the sun onto the yellow varnished walls and bare floor. Everything on the table flashed and glittered. In the middle there was an old salad bowl filled with yellow and red nasturtiums. She smiled, and a look of deep content shone in her eyes. "You might cut me a slice of that bread, Mother," said Stanley. "I've only 12.5 minutes before the coach passes. Has anyone given my shoes to the servant girl?" "Yes, they're ready for you." Mrs. Fairfield was quite unruffled. "Oh, Kezia, why are you such a messy child?" cried Beryl despairingly. "Me, Aunt Beryl?" Kezia stared at her. What had she done now? She had only dug a river down the middle of her porridge, filled it, and was eating the banks away. But she did that every single morning, and no one had said a word up till now. "Why can't you eat your food properly like Isabel and Lottie?" How unfair grown-ups are. "But Lottie always makes a floating island, don't you, Lottie?" "I don't," said Isabel smartly. "I just sprinkle mine with sugar and put on the milk and finish it. Only babies play with their food." Stanley pushed back his chair and got up. "Would you get me those shoes, Mother? And Beryl, if you've finished, I wish you'd cut down to the gate and stop the coach. Run into your mother, Isabel, and ask where my bowler hat's been put. Wait a minute. Have you children been playing with my stick?" "No, Father." "But I put it here," Stanley began to bluster. "I remember distinctly putting it in this corner. Now who's had it? There's no time to lose. Look sharp. The stick's got to be found." Even Alice, the servant girl, was drawn into the chase. "You haven't been using it to poke the kitchen fire by any chance?" Stanley dashed into the bedroom where Linda was lying. "Most extraordinary thing. I can't keep a single possession to myself. They've made away with my stick now." "Stick, dear? What stick?" Linda's vagueness on these occasions could not be real, Stanley decided. Would nobody sympathise with him? "Coach! Coach, Stanley!" Beryl's voice cried from the gate. Stanley waved his arm to Linda. "No time to say goodbye," he cried, and he meant that as a punishment to her. He snatched his bowler hat, dashed out of the house, and swung down the garden path. Yes, the coach was there waiting, and Beryl, leaning over the open gate, was laughing up at somebody or other just as if nothing had happened. The heartlessness of women! The way they took it for granted it was your job to slave away from them, while they didn't even take the trouble to see that your walking stick wasn't lost. Kelly trailed his whip across the horses. "Goodbye, Stanley," called Beryl, sweetly and gaily. It was easy enough to say goodbye, and there she stood, idle, shading her eyes with a hand. The worst of it was Stanley had to shout goodbye too, for the sake of appearances. Then he saw her turn, give a little skip, and run back to the house. She was glad to be rid of him. Yes, she was thankful. Into the living room she ran and called, "He's gone!" Linda cried to her from her room, "Beryl, has Stanley gone?" Old Mrs. Fairfield appeared, carrying the boy in his little flannel coatee. "Gone! Gone!" Oh, the relief, the difference it made to have the man out of the house. Their very voices were changed as they called to one another. They sounded warm and loving, and as if they shared a secret. Beryl went over to the table. "Have another cup of tea, Mother. It's still hot." She wanted, somehow, to celebrate the fact that they could do what they liked now. There was no man to disturb them. The whole perfect day was theirs. "No, thank you, child," said old Mrs. Fairfield. But the way at that moment she tossed the boy up and said a goose, a ga to him meant that she felt the same. The little girls ran into the paddock like chickens let out of a coop. Even Alice, the servant girl, washing up the dishes in the kitchen, caught the infection and used the precious tank water in a perfectly reckless fashion. "Oh, these men," said she. and she plunged the teapot into the bowl and held it under the water, even after it had stopped the bubbling, as if it too was a man, and drowning was too good for them. 4. "Wait for me, Isabel! Kezia, wait for me!" There was poor little Lottie left behind again, because she found it so fearfully hard to get over the stile by herself. When she stood on the first step, her knees began to wobble. She grasped the post. Then you had to put one leg over. But which leg? She never could decide. And when she did finally put one leg over with a sort of stamp of despair, then the feeling was awful. She was half in the paddock still and half in the tussock grass. She clutched the post desperately and lifted up her voice. "Wait for me!" "No, don't you wait for her, Kezia," said Isabel. "She's such a little silly. She's always making a fuss. Come on!" And she tugged Kezia's jersey. "You can use my bucket if you come with me," she said kindly. "It's bigger than yours." But Kezia couldn't leave Lottie all by herself. She ran back to her. By this time Lottie was very red in the face and breathing heavily. "Here, put your other foot over," said Kezia. "Where?" Lottie looked down at Kezia as if from a mountain height. "Here, where my hand is." Kezia patted the place. "Oh, there, do you mean?" Lottie gave a deep sigh and put the second foot over. "Now, sort of turn round and sit down and slide," said Kezia. "But there's nothing to sit down on, Kezia," said Lottie. She managed it at last, and once it was over she shook herself and began to beam. "I'm getting better at climbing over stiles, aren't I, Kezia?" Lottie's was a very hopeful nature. The pink and the blue sunbonnet followed Isabel's bright red sunbonnet up that sliding, slipping hill. At the top they paused to decide where to go and to have a good stare at who was there already. Seen from behind, standing against the skyline, gesticulating largely with their spades, they looked like minute puzzled explorers. The whole family of Samuel Josephs was there already with their lady help, who sat on a camp stool and kept order with a whistle that she wore tied round her neck, and a small cane with which she directed operations. The Samuel Josephs never played by themselves or managed their own game. If they did, it ended in the boys pouring water down the girls' necks, or the girls trying to put little black crabs into the boys' pockets. So Mrs. S.J. and the poor lady help drew up what she called a programme every morning to keep them abused and out of mischief. It was all competitions or races or round games. Everything began with a piercing blast of the lady help's whistle and ended with another. There were even prizes, large, rather dirty paper parcels which the lady help, with a sour little smile, drew out of a bulging string kit. The Samuel Josephs fought fearfully for the prizes, and cheated and pinched one another's arms. They were all expert pinchers. The only time the Burnell children ever played with them, Kezia had got a prize, and when she undid 3 bits of paper she found a very small, rusty button-hook. She couldn't understand why they made such a fuss. But they never played with the Samuel Josephs now, or even went to their parties. The Samuel Josephs were always giving children's parties at the Bay, and there was always the same food. A big wash-hand basin of very brown fruit salad, buns cut into 4, and a wash-hand jug full of something the lady help called lemonade. And you went away in the evening with half the frill torn off your frock, or something spilled all down the front of your open-work pinafore, leaving the Samuel Josephs leaping like savages on their lawn. No, they were too awful. On the other side of the beach, close down to the water, 2 little boys, their knickers rolled up, twinkled like spiders. One was digging, the other pattered in and out of the water, filling a small bucket. They were the trout boys, Pip and Rags. But Pip was so busy digging, and Rags was so busy helping, that they didn't see their little cousins until they were quite close. "Look," said Pip, "look what I've discovered." And he showed them an old, wet, squashed-looking boot. The 3 little girls stared. "Whatever are you going to do with it?" asked Kezia. "Keep it, of course." Pip was very scornful. "It's a find, see?" Yes, Kezia saw that, all the same. "There's a lot of things buried in the sand," explained Pip. "They get chucked up from wrecks. Treasure. Why, you might find—" "But why does Rags have to keep on pouring water in?" asked Lottie. "Oh, that's to moisten it," said Pip, "to make the work a bit easier. Keep it up, Rags." And good little Rags ran up and down, pouring in the water that turned brown like cocoa. "Here, shall I show you what I found yesterday?" said Pip mysteriously, and he stuck his spade into the sand. "Promise not to tell." They promised. "Say, cross my heart, straight dinkum." The little girl said it. Pip took something out of his pocket, rubbed it a long time on the front of his jersey, then breathed on it and rubbed it again. "Now turn around," he ordered. They turned round. "All look the same way. Keep still. Now." And his hand opened. He held up to the light something that flashed, that winked, that was a most lovely green. "It's an emerald," said Pip solemnly. "Is it really, Pip?" Even Isabel was impressed. The lovely green thing seemed to dance in Pip's fingers. Auntie Beryl had an emerald in a ring, but it was a very small one. This one was as big as a star, and far more beautiful. 5. As the morning lengthened, whole parties appeared over the sandhills and came down on the beach to bathe. It was understood that at 11 o'clock the women and children of the summer colony had the sea to themselves. First the women undressed, pulled on their bathing dresses, and covered their heads in hideous caps like sponge bags. Then the children were unbuttoned. The beach was strewn with little heaps of clothes and shoes. The big summer hats, with stones on them to keep them from blowing away, looked like immense shells. It was strange that even the sea seemed to sound differently when all those leaping, laughing figures ran into the waves. Old Mrs. Fairfield, in a lilac cotton dress and a black hat tied under the chin, gathered her little brood and got them ready. The little trout boys whipped their shirts over their heads, and away the five sped, while their grandma sat with one hand in her knitting bag, ready to draw out the ball of wool when she was satisfied they were safely in. The firm, compact little girls were not half so brave as the tender, delicate-looking little boys. Pips and Rags, shivering, crouching down, slapping the water, never hesitated. But Isabel, who could swim 12 strokes, and Kezia, who could nearly swim 8, only followed on the strict understanding that they were not to be splashed. As for Lottie, she didn't follow at all. She liked to be left to go her own way, please. And that way was to sit down at the edge of the water, her legs straight, her knees pressed together, and to make vague motions with her arms as if she expected to be wafted out to sea. But when a bigger wave than usual, an old whiskery one, came lolloping along in her direction, she scrambled to her feet with a face of horror and flew up the beach again. "Here, mother, keep those for me, will you?" 2 rings and a thin gold chain were dropped into Mrs. Fairfield's lap. "Yes, dear, but aren't you going to bathe here?"